Hello and welcome. This evening, my very special guest is Mike Carey. We are here to talk about his brand new book, Once Was Willem. Here is the Broken Binding special edition you can see in wonderful blue with the
Lovely
sprayed
cover.
edges. And I've just got to show off the front again because it's just amazing with the text on it. I absolutely love this. It's just wonderful. I'm so glad to have a copy of it. So thanks for joining us, Mike. And for those who
Okay.
don't know much about it, can you tell them a little bit about what Once Was Willem is all about, please?
Yeah, for sure. So I guess it's a folk horror more than anything else. It's set in the 12th century, in a period of English history which is known as the Anarchy. It was after the death of Henry I. His son, William Beauclerk, um, no, William Adeline, sorry, had died on the White Ship, had died in tragic circumstances, and he left no other son. And so he tried to leave the kingdom to his daughter Matilda. But then a cousin, sorry, a nephew of his, Stephen, said, "Well, it should be me. I'm related to the dead king. I'm related to William the Conqueror. It should be me." And he stepped in, and then Matilda invaded. And there was a period of about like 20 or 30 years when there was no one sitting on the throne. There was
Right.
no sort of no acknowledged king or queen. And we had invading armies on British soil, multiple invading armies. And it was referred to in chronicles of the time as an age when Christ and his angels were all asleep because there was just complete breakdown of order, complete breakdown of law. So that's the background of the story. Against that backdrop, various bad barons are trying to sort of claw power for themselves. Um, and in a little village north of the River Trent, there's one particular bad baron who starts to do appalling things to the village of Cosham. The village of Cosham reaches out for somebody to protect themselves. They try to buy mercenaries, that doesn't work. Um, if you can't hire mercenaries, why not hire monsters? It's basically the Seven Samurai or the Magnificent Seven,
Mhm.
but done with monsters.
Amazing. That sounds good. So, where did the seed of the idea for this come from? I mean, were you just looking into this part of history and things started to gather in your brain, or where did it come from?
No, it actually, like a lot of my stories, like a lot of my novels, it began as a short. It began as a
Ah,
short piece. Um, I did a short story for an anthology called "It Was a Dark and Stormy Night," and the only sort of rule for contributions was that they had to start with that sentence.
right.
And I hummed and hawed over it for a while, and then I came up with this idea of a whole horde of monsters attacking a castle in some very poorly specified medieval setting, probably not England, probably somewhere in Middle Europe.
Hmm.
Um, and then, as so often happens, I thought, there's probably more here than just a short, particularly more to the central character, who wasn't called Willem, or Once Was Willem in the short. I forget what his name was in the short. And I just started sort of like retooling it during the lockdowns, in fact.
Ah,
During the first lockdown, I was working on a completely different novel, Infinity Gate, and it fell apart in my hands. I was trying to do rewrites on it, and it just disintegrated. I don't know if that's ever happened to you, but the more I tinkered with it, the less I had. And
right.
in the end, I was just a nervous wreck. So I put it away, and I thought, well, I'll work on something completely different. And I wrote Once Was Willem in the space of about 2 months, 10 weeks, something like
Wow.
that. It came really, really fast. I mean, it's not a very long novel, but it flowed really easily, and it was sort of a healing experience.
Give your brain a bit of a rest whilst you work
Hmm.
on something completely different, stretch different muscles, and come back and try and go back to Infinity Gate afterwards.
Yeah, and then Infinity Gate. Well, after that break, Infinity Gate made more sense. I wasn't afraid of it anymore, and I could sort of like come back and resume work.
You're riding that high from one to the next.
Yeah, yeah.
So, did you have to do a lot of research into this 12th century then in England? Oh, I know there's monsters and magic and there's extrapolation and sort of fantastical elements, but were you spending much time doing the research for this period?
No, hardly any, to be honest. I'm far from conscientious when it comes to research. I mean, it references those historical events, and it
Yeah.
references some actual personages who were around at the time. Um, at one point, it uses the trial and execution of a rebel as a way of fixing a point in time. But it takes place at a far remove from
Right.
all of the actual historical events, so it is just backdrop, just flavor, really, in
Mm.
some ways. I mean, I went shopping for an appropriate time period, and I thought the anarchy sounded about right, as a time when there would have been all of these extreme threats, and there would have been no way to appeal to any external authority. And
Mm.
so, the idea of sort of like recruiting um, recruiting mercenary monsters made a lot of sense to me. I
So,
don't know what I was drinking at the time.
well, yeah, I was gonna say in lockdown, I think we're all drinking a lot of stuff. Um, so I also read that there's some Christian and some Norse mythology elements in the story. Is that right? Or some folklore that you're pulling on?
Yeah, lots and lots of different strands of folklore. I mean, there's a sort of version of Jenny Greenteeth in there who's called Unsung Jill.
Hmm.
There are Norse shapeshifters, Olfednars. That's kind of that's the only reference really to Norse folklore. And as far as the Christian cosmology goes, I've got a fair amount of Gnostic stuff in there.
Right.
Yaldabaoth, the Gnostic deity, gets a look in only in this story. He's really an angel rather than I guess he's a demiurge, really. He's a creator under the universal God. Um, so yeah, that the Gnostic tradition is in there. I've got sort of anatomically correct angels as they're described in the Old Testament. There was wheels within wheels and all these eyes floating
Yeah.
around.
Very sort of not what you think of when people think of angels. They tend to think of the a man with wings, and that's
Yeah,
it. And they think, and you go, well, there's a lot of very bizarre descriptions when you go through different choirs in the Bible.
yeah, and they would have been terrifying. I mean, they sound like they sound like monsters.
Yeah, alien abductions to me, some of them, because they look so bizarre. I'd be like, I don't know what it was, some kind of weird alien.
But
Uh,
I mean, I was sort of throwing all those things together, and then I was playing my own variations on them. So yeah, my shapeshifters, for example, one of them is a very traditional sort of weird bear, a bear man. When he transformed, he just transformed into a big brown bear. But the other one, his sister Anna, she kind of transformed into a bit of anything and everything. She's like a whole litany of all the forms that flesh can take, and
that's
that turns out to be relevant.
yeah, yeah. Sounds fun though. It does sound good. So the character is told, sorry, the story is told in first person from Willem's point of view, and I'm trying not to spoil anything, but he's someone who has come back from the dead, essentially. Um, were there any sort of challenges with writing that point of view for someone who has died and returned and is seeing the world perhaps with different eyes?
I think there was a challenge in getting the voice right, certainly, because I don't know to what extent I did, but I was what I was trying for was a voice that sounded plausibly medieval without actually being authentically medieval. Because if I'd written it in Middle English, it would have been completely impenetrable to
Yeah.
most modern audiences. So I wanted it to have sort of archaisms in it, and to have constructions that sounded old, um, and to sort of put that into the reader's mind as they sort of went through the story. Um, but as far as Willem's status, or Once Was Willem's status, as a revenant or a zombie or whatever you want to call him, it kind of gave me a lot of license because he dies as a boy. He dies as a preteen child,
Hmm.
um, but he comes back as something completely different. Um, as he tries to explain it himself at the point in the story, and he says it's like every single part of me is brain, just like every single part of me is hand, or every single part of me is heart. And
Hmm.
so he has a clarity of thought and a clarity of understanding that he didn't have. And there's a kind of a formality to the way he speaks, which I think sets it apart from a child's voice. It's something different from that. I've also got there's a point where he asks for a gift from one of the other characters, and the gift is to see other people's thoughts, to see other people's motivations, so that he can be an omniscient narrator without any cheating. He genuinely knows exactly what was going on in the minds of all of the other characters at every point in the story.
Fascinating. Fascinating. And of course, this isn't the first time you've written an undead character as a main character, or as a young child, actually, with the girl with all the gifts, and the boy in the bridge. Is that
Yep.
right? Yeah, I
Yeah,
can't remember. I can't.
I was playing chess with Cat Webb today, Claire North,
Yeah.
uh, which I often do, and she always wins. Um, but she said at one point, "Is there a Carey story that doesn't have a creepy kid in it?" There must be somewhere, but yeah, I do have recourse to creepy kids quite a lot. You
Is
can't
it?
go wrong with a creepy kid.
Is it the clarity where a child's inquisitiveness as well, because they're not as jaded, but they have very clear views of their own of the world, right or wrong as a child. As an adult, we're a lot more narrow in our focus and our thinking, I think, compared to
Yeah,
children.
that is a big part of it. The kind of the vividness, the power, and the immediacy of a child's perceptions. The way that when you're a child, every single thing, no matter how tiny, can sort of like fill your whole mental space.
Mm.
And certainly in Girl with All the Gifts, that was what I wanted to convey through Melanie. That was why I chose Melanie's eyes. But I think the other thing is there's something really powerful about having like an innocent as an narrator, and to be discovering their world at the same time as they discover it.
Yeah, yeah. And children tend to ask the questions that we want to ask but don't. And
Yeah,
they just cut through all the noise and say, well, why is this? And we'll sort of hum and ha and make up excuses, and sometimes they're like, well, just why? So I think it's quite a good
yeah,
narrative
yeah.
tool.
They don't take anything for granted. Yeah.
So I was going to say, one of my questions that was saying that you've written over a dozen novels, I was going to say, was this one any easier? But clearly it seems to have flowed out a lot better than some of the other ones.
Yeah, you never know what you're going to get, do you? I can't remember who said this, but yeah, when you solve the problem of a novel, you solve the problem of that novel. It doesn't help you with the next one, and it's true, isn't it? Yeah, every outing is different, is its own thing, and I think just the sheer relief of sort of being able to get away from Infinity Gate. I don't get me wrong, I in the end I loved writing Infinity Gate, but I had a really hard time with it. It went through crazy rewrites. Whereas Once Was Willem, the final draft is almost the same as the first draft, but there's
Oh, wow.
very, very little that was changed. And most of what was changed was just detail. Um, there's a kind of there's a kind of simplicity to the structure. It's not exactly linear because Willem does a lot of little sidebars, little excursions where he talks about this or that character. He'll sort of he'll stop in the middle of what he's saying and say, "Well, now I need to tell you about how Cal and Anna came to be in England, or this is what Cain Caradoc, the evil sorcerer, was doing around about that." But there is ultimately quite a linear structure to the story, even if it's not always told in a straight line. And I think that simplicity sort of helped with the writing. And as always, it helped once I got the voice right. I think I tend to start with voice
Right.
and let everything else sort of unfold from there. If I feel like I've got the narrative voice, then I have a lot more confidence
Mm.
uh, unfolding the story.
Do you plan your novels, or to what degree do you normally plan your novels?
When I started out, I planned them in obsessive and ridiculous detail, and that was because I was coming from comics. Um,
Mm.
when I first started writing prose, which was when I was in my 20s, I was really, really bad at it. And the main reason why I was bad was structure. I
Right.
just didn't have any sense of how to shape a story. I just write a chapter, write another chapter, write another chapter, and see where it ended up. Um, I once sent a novel to HarperCollins, and then the rejection letter said, "You should try writing this as a novel."
Wow.
Yeah, that was
Oh.
devastating. That was really devastating. Um, But yeah, when you write comics, especially when you write sort of like mainstream American comics, you have a canvas which is both small and absolutely fixed. You know, you
Mm.
have 20 pages, or you have 22 pages, or sometimes you have 17 pages. And if you run out of pages before you run out of story, then you're stuffed because nobody's going to lend you another page. Um, and so you become obsessive, you become miserly.
Mm.
You start sort of thinking of ways to trim a scene down from 2 pages to one, so that you can have a splash page, or so that you can have a cutaway to another scene or whatever. And coming out of that back into prose writing, um, I initially maybe overplanned, but certainly planned in obsessive detail. The plan for the first Castor novel, The Devil You Know,
Hmm.
18,000 words.
Wow.
It was
Okay.
like it was like almost novella length. I still got it. It's a hideous thing. But I think the usefulness of a plan is that once you've got a plan, you can ignore it. When a better idea comes along, you can deviate from the plan and sort of go off and explore that, knowing that you can always come back, that it'll always be there when you need it.
Yeah, I suppose it's useful to have that skeleton framework to refer to
But
if you need to.
yeah, but more recently I've become sort of looser about it. And yeah, with Once Was Willem, and I think to a certain extent with Infinity Gate and Echo of Worlds, I had a really strong sense of what the ending was going to be. I knew how the threads were going to come together at the climax.
Hmm.
So I knew how to position the characters so that they would be heading towards that climax. But yeah, then there's a lot of stuff that just happens because it happens along the way. Yeah, you discover the rest of the shape as you start to fill it in.
I think Joe Abercrombie did that. Like he said, when he started, he planned it, and now he sort of leaves a lot of wiggle room, knowing where the end is, and he trusts the process that when he gets to the end, somehow it will all come together
Yeah,
in the edits, but he'll get a version, and then in the edits he'll make it cleaner and closer to what he thinks it should be in his brain, which makes sense.
and generally that works. Sometimes you can get to the midpoint and think, actually, there's stuff here that's never going to go anywhere. Like the first draft of Girl with All the Gifts had a massively involved subplot about a birthday party that Miss Justineau, the teacher,
Right.
Melanie and the other zombie kids decided to give her a surprise party, even though most of the time they're confined to these wheelchairs, and with the arm and foot restraints. And it got very, very involved, and it got really long, it got longer and longer. At a certain point, I thought, this is not getting me anywhere. And I just excised that entire thread.
Yeah, I've had that a couple of times. My editor said, for clarity of the rest of the story, this side story that goes off here doesn't fit, and so we've culled things out after the fact. But I don't always know what the theme of my story is until I get to the end. So
Right.
it's rare that I know what the theme is. So when you were working with Once with Willem, did you have any particular themes in mind? Or was it all, as you're saying, you started with the character?
With the character, and then yeah, with the idea of the seven champions. Yeah, that sort of immemorial story that I think goes all the way back to Aeschylus, doesn't it? Yeah, one of the oldest stories we have is the Seven Against Thebes.
Right.
However, we don't have much of it. Most of the versions have been lost.
Mm.
Um, so I wanted it to be that story, like in some ways a very, very familiar story of a battle between good and evil, where good wins, even though good is like very, very heavily outnumbered. Um, and apart from that, it was just throwing a whole bunch of folkloric elements into the mix and seeing how it tasted. So yeah, insofar as there are themes, and I think there are themes of community. There are themes of yeah, there are monsters and there is monstering.
Mm.
There's this whole question of acceptance or rejection of the other,
Yeah.
um, and yeah, the extent to which you can forgive. I guess the power of forgiveness. I've written an awful lot of gentle protagonists recently. Willem is a gentle protagonist. Paz in Infinity Gate is a gentle and kind protagonist, and Foley in the Rampart trilogy. I like gentleness a lot. I think it's an underrated virtue. So yeah, you have in Once Was Willem, you have a lot of people who, to varying degrees, have been persecuted, have been outcasts, and are
Mm,
then asked to step in to help the people who've done those things to them. So they have to sort of, they have to triumph over their own grievances, their own hurt feelings. There's a scene where Anna, the shapeshifter, who is the sort of much more powerful of the two,
mm,
decides that she's going to punish one of the villagers of Goshen for, but basically for child murder, for killing Bethany, the witch character, for being the one that lit the flame when she was burned at the stake. And she's in a righteous rage. She said, you can't ask us to save your children when you yourself are child murderers, and she's going to hang him.
yeah.
And it would be disastrous if she did it because it would like completely end any trust between the villagers and the little group of champions. It would kind of like it would make everything disintegrate. And Willem and the ghost of the dead girl have to talk her down. And in some ways, it's kind of like the fulcrum of the entire story because it's where the whole question of forgiveness versus vengeance really comes to the surface.
And the idea that Willem himself isn't exactly just a normal boy. He's someone who's come back from the dead. So just to look at him, people would assume that he's monstrous because
Yeah,
he's another straight away, just from a distance.
yeah. He describes himself in sort of fairly vague terms, but you sort of get the impression that he's a bit Frankensteinian.
Right.
Um, he's ill-made, thwart. His limbs don't work. His bones don't fit right. Um, he's basically a best guess. The spell that tried to bring him from the grave didn't have enough to work with, and so it did what it could.
And yet he's the gentle hero of the story.
Yeah,
So yeah, yes, judging people by their books by their cover and that sort of thing.
yeah. There's a scene between him and his father, which I think worked pretty well, is because his parents are they're not only sort of horrified by him, he's kind of the living sign of their guilt. Yeah, they were
Mm,
the ones that decided to employ a sorcerer to bring him back, and this is what they've got, and they can't accept him, and they don't want to sort of have any ownership of him and any part of him. And his father comes to kill him, but fails because he's sort of unkillable. It's very, very difficult to kill him because he just sort of, he's made of soup. He just flows back together again when you. Um, and then there's a scene between the two of them, which is a scene of kind of reconciliation. And maybe that's overstating it, but a scene of each of them sort of accepting that, this is never going to come right, but they can at least sort of recognize each other
mm.
as father and son.
Um, I think it was last year or the year before you released The Ghost in Bone, which was a Casta novella, which I think the last book was Naming of the Beast in 2009. So
Yes.
been quite a long time. How was it coming back to the character after all that time?
It was great. It was great fun, but it was scary. It was scary at first because of that whole thing about voice. I said I always start out with voice, and
Yeah.
the voice of the Castor novels is sort of stolen from Raymond Chandler with the serial numbers filed off. It's my attempt to do classic noir. Um, yeah, with a few of my own sort of like little sort of noodlings added in. And it had been, yeah, as you say, it had been like almost 15 years
Mm.
since I'd done it. And I thought, yeah, there are examples of people coming back to novel series late and like really messing it up. I don't know if you've read the Borrower books by Mary Norton.
No.
The first four are little masterpieces of children's fiction, and the fifth one, The Borrower's Avenged, is a nightmare, an atrocity. It was 20 years later,
Oof.
and she had become both a raging Tory and a spiritualist. So
Right.
so suddenly borrowers are little Englanders, and also borrowers can see ghosts, and it's just oh. Um, and for a long time, I felt like that about Tahanu, the fourth Earthsea novel, because
Mm.
it was
Hmm.
so different in style, so different in subject matter
Yeah.
from the original trilogy. I've come I've come around to sort of recognizing its greatness, but it was felt like, yeah, it just felt like such a departure. So I was scared. I was scared that I wouldn't be able to get back into Castor's voice. But actually, it just came. Once I started writing him, he just became the same irritating, soppy bastard that he'd always been, and it all came right. That was because Bill Shaffer at Subterranean, he'd always wanted to do like a boxed set of the
Right.
cast, and
Yes.
it had never come together.
Oh.
And he just sent me an email, said, "Do you want to do another Castor story, a novella?"
Mhm.
I said, "Yeah, I really do."
Yeah, I have that fear about revisiting stories, and I think if I'm not sure if I'd go back. I'd have to have a good idea in mind to make me want to go revisit, I think.
I think you've got to approach it like very cautiously.
Mm. Yeah. So recently you've been doing some comics, actually. I just want to mention that before we go. You've been doing a six issue The Lycan with Thomas Jane.
That was not recently.
Is that not recently?
No, it's only just come out. It's like I
Like
think it's
issue
out.
one's out of six, isn't it?
Yeah, but I wrote it 15 years ago.
God. Oh wow. Okay. That's
Yeah, so that was a really weird story. So I was approached by Thomas Jane and Tim Bradstreet. Tim
yeah.
Bradstreet was the cover artist on Hellblazer, which I was writing at the time, or
Mm.
which I'd just finished writing. And they were setting up their own comic company, and they had like this really fully worked out idea for a series. It was a very circumstantial plan, and they said, "Do you want to write it?" And I went back and forth on it because I don't normally work that way. Yeah, we're working from somebody else's very full schematic.
Yeah.
But it was a good story. It was a werewolf story set during the Napoleonic Wars, but off to one side, on a sort of remote island off the coast of England. I thought, yeah, what the hell? It will come really quickly because the structure's all there. What I'm mainly doing is like giving voice to the characters, fleshing out the story. And I had fun with it. I did all six scripts in the space of maybe 3 or 4 months, and then sent them in. They got an artist to work on it, a guy named Sean Connor.
Mhm.
Um, and he was great. He was sort of like he was drawing like Bernie Wrightson. It was really beautiful stuff, but very slow. And it got
Ah.
slower and slower. And then he disappeared from the face of the earth. You were talking about alien abductions earlier.
Yeah.
The aliens got him because, you know, not only did he stop handing in pages, but he also stopped turning up at conventions. And I don't know anybody else who's seen him since. So,
Wow.
so we were left with some gorgeous art, but no way of finishing the comic, and it just languished for ages. And then,
Oh wow.
but I guess Thomas had never entirely given up on it, and he made a deal with Comixology. He found Diego Yapur,
Mhm.
who I think has done a fantastic job on the art. It looks really good.
Mm.
And yeah, suddenly I was told it was happening. But the only comic I've written recently is the other one, Ghost Box,
Mhm.
the one with Pablo Raimondi. And that's kind of like that's I think it's classic Vertigo in feel, isn't it? Sort of like early 2000s Vertigo or 90s Vertigo. A box, some ghosts, angels again, lots of angels.
Mhm.
Um, that felt like coming home.
Of course, you did The Unwritten. That was a long running creator owned series. Do you want to do something like that again, or is it just because you're doing more novels these days, you just want to do shorter projects on comics if they come up?
Yeah, I don't know. It's been an awful long time since I did an ongoing.
Mm.
So when Jonathan Hickman took over the lead writing on X-Men,
Yeah.
he asked me if I wanted to come back and write something in the X-Men franchise, and
Mm.
I had to say no
Oh,
because writing a Marvel book that's in continuity
yeah.
means you've got to stay abreast of all the other stuff that's happening in continuity, and it's really a full-time job.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's labor intensive. I loved doing it, but I don't think I've got the bandwidth to do it anymore. I could do something like Unwritten, yeah, something that's like something that stands by itself.
Mm.
And there is something really cool about monthly periodical storytelling. You know, the just the sort of the patchwork quiltiness of it all, the sort of way it finds its own path
Mm.
at its own level, like water. I loved that kind of writing. So yeah, if I got this, if I got an offer, I probably would do that again. But I wouldn't go back into superhero comics. I don't think, and not because I don't love them, but because I can't. I just can't do it.
Yeah, the continuity makes it very, very impenetrable for new readers. Never mind if you're trying to write it, you've got to stay abreast of all the other stories within that same universe. It takes a lot of time, as you say.
And I guess the other thing is you can't write what you don't read, and I'm not reading any superhero stuff at the moment.
Mm,
I think you have to be a fan, I think, of the stuff that you're writing. You have to be in genre
yeah.
uh, as a consumer in order to be part of the conversation, I think.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, yeah. Right. Well, thanks for joining us. I'll remind everyone again that Once with Willem is out. There are some copies left of the Broken Binding Special Edition, so there'll be links down below where people can check that out. But just want to say thanks for taking some time, Mike, for talking to us, and
Thank you.
well, I'll see you soon.
Yeah, cheers.
Bye, everyone.